I'm always thinking that language is important. And when we have a word meeting that has a lot of history, and what if we would like to start from the scratch and think that we would like to meet each other, and how could we call it to make a difference? Or, there's conferences and unconferences. So what unmeetings would look like?
I love it.
So then what is the human part of it? And I always end up at imagination. And I think, part of us being human is our imagination, which is even different than creativity in my mind. So if we can get the administration and the transactional parts done, we can be more imaginative. So I don't think it'll replace gatherings and meetings, as you mentioned, Martin. I think it'll allow us to be more imaginative together as a team.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
See how many people you can get to be curious together, to see, and not to be afraid, because I think there's a lot of fear out there at the moment as well with all of this. And don't be afraid of it. We do have influence over all of this as individuals. So if we use these tools in a positive, imaginative, creative way, then that can be a good thing. That can really enhance life, actually, as we know it. Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the conversation, it's certainly in my mind, it's left me with a massive amount more things that you would now want to explore, delve into, consider, than certainly what I had in my mind when we started the conversation. Ilkka, you started with the concept of real-time analysis by AI, and that analysis could be done thematically, through summaries, through filtering, through identifying concerns, and so on. We talked then about the possibility of AI being able to support the engagement of significantly bigger numbers, 50, 80, 100, 150 people, where it can keep track of considerably more data than the normal human participant or facilitator. I suppose what that leads to, and Jim, I think you picked this one up, was the idea that maybe our whole concept of what it means to meet needs to shift. But that would have to be qualified by a point that Karen and Ilkka made, which is that while we may not like meetings, as humans, we absolutely not only like to meet, I think, but we need to meet. That's part of the human condition. Jim, you raised the point that if we don't meet, how do we have community? How do we have organizations? How do we have groups? How do we have teams? So the picture emerging from our conversation is that AI has this possibility to act as a fly on the wall. I think I introduced the phrase fly on the wall. It has that possibility not to take over the meeting, but actually to add to the meeting something that we humans actually can't add to the meeting. We can't step back from the totality of the conversation that's taking place. We can't analyze that totality in real time. AI can do that. And then it can feed back into the conversation. And Ilkka, your point just towards the end of our discussion was maybe it can feed back in with a judicious question, with a thought-provoking question, with a summarizing question that can help to bring focus back, not to where AI decides the focus should be, but where AI has analyzed our content and said, here's the breakdown, here's the weighting, here's the emotion, and when we put it together algorithmically, here's the conclusion that you guys are reaching, not that AI is reaching. But that then brings us to, I suppose, I raised the point about security and the concept of, if we're all being recorded, if that recording is being retained and the purpose or role to which that recording is put in the short future or even in the long future, do we end up needing to protect and preserve that through some form of legislative framework? Jim, you raised the point that, well, perhaps organization norms, culture, standing operating procedures, guidelines, perhaps they can help us here. But it also begs the question that if people use AI output nefariously, then does it expose people to the point where they stop contributing themselves or of themselves out of concern that they may be misrepresented at a later date because that recording is there? And Ilke, you made the point that transcripts of the recordings are even more risky because they're now searchable. And so there's a big question there that we've touched on, but we haven't explored or we haven't bottomed it out. The overall conclusion that I'm drawing from our conversation so far is actually AI won't make meetings obsolete because we're humans, we're going to continue meeting. However, AI has a very strong possibility of completely transforming what we mean by meetings. And we all might just need to go back to the drawing board to say, well, what do we want meetings to be in light of the fact that we have this ear fly on the wall who can do so much more that we can't? And then we can ask ourselves, okay, how might we change our meetings in order to make maximum use of this all listening fly on the wall?
Martin, I think we are reaching out our time. Our viewers will be eager to stay with us for another hour or so, but I'm sure we have plenty of stuff to do after this cup of coffee, watching us on LinkedIn or on our social media channels where we are showing this interesting conversation so far. So what have we learned about the art of hosting face-to-face meetings so far? And
yeah,
the wrap up on the program today.
What a whirlwind. Where would I start? We need to get AI to do the analysis, Paul.
There you go. That too.
let me have a crack at it. We started by suggesting, Kirsty, you pitched in first saying maybe we're out of practice with the face-to-face meetings. What we discovered was that the virtual meetings that we attended, particularly during the pandemic, probably gave all of us a degree of respite that allowed us to switch off cameras, switch off microphones, take a pause, step back, scream at the camera without anybody knowing that we were screaming. And we had to rehabituate ourselves back into face-to-face. But then we very quickly changed tack. We said, do we actually have face-to-face expertise in meetings? And that brought us onto a completely different track and a really interesting track. So a couple of things that came out of that. We basically talked about meeting leadership, meeting management, and we used our own personal anecdotes and so on to explore the idea that just because you're the leader doesn't mean you have to be the chair. If you are going to be the chair, are we presupposing a particular type of meeting? And does that cover all possible types of meetings? And I think we pretty much agreed, well, actually, it does presuppose and we have to chair every meeting, but we have to manage our meetings. So that brought us into the whole area of preparation for meetings, pre-planning for meetings, the importance of setting the outcome before we ever get into the beginning of the meeting. So we explored that a little bit. Kirsty, you took us into the purpose, the outcome, the structure, and the time, POST, as a simple but really illuminating acronym for if you answer those 4 key questions in preparation, there's a very, very good chance that you're going to have the right people, the right time, and you're going to have the right. We then talked a little bit about post-action reviews. We drifted into the military a little bit. We talked about aviation, which I brought in because that's my own personal professional background. We talked about evaluation apprehension as a possible reason why many organizations don't seem to reflect on their meetings. And we very briefly explored why that might be. And I suggested an idea that Edward de Bono actually came up with, which is the use of plus minus interesting as a really simple tool, a bit like POST in preparing for meetings. Well, maybe we can have a PMI at the meeting to evaluate in a safe way, but in a slightly self-critical way. Critical positive, critical negative, but equally critical, did anything interesting come up? We then segued, we did a major left turn, I think was the way you called it, Joe. And we started to talk about AI. And I'm certain we could be here for another 3 or 4 hours talking in the direction that we had started to go. But I leave it at that. I hope that's a reasonably faithful and quick summary of some of the key points that we managed about in a really interesting discussion.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you so much for summarizing this. We'll compare now with our AI note taker and we'll judge. Everybody in this meeting will be able to judge that. So final word, golden nugget. Kirsty, Joe, what do you have to share with our viewers here on LinkedIn? Perhaps they will be looking for you guys as meeting doctors to help them on their meetings. Can I have a golden nugget from both of you to close these today?
I think Joe's taught me something about me, which is evaluation apprehension. So thank you, Joe. That was, you've named something for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah. And Kirsty, thank you for POST, because that was a great acronym that speaks it's very similar to the two questions I always tell people to ask themselves when they're about to schedule a meeting. One, does the meeting have a purpose? If say yes, ask the second question, which is, does that meeting require collaboration? Or does that purpose require collaboration? If you say yes to both of those, proceed to schedule your meeting. If you say no to either one, stop it.
Yeah.
You probably don't need a meeting.
Love it.
Okay, guys, so this is about it. That I hope that you enjoy the program with us today, and please stay with us, as next month we're going to expand on this conversation and bringing AI into the field. That's all for now, and thank you so much for watching.
One of these discussion topics that we could fill a day if we had a day. We've run out of time. I think it feels like it's probably been one of the quickest conversations we've had in our fireside chats. I normally try to do a kind of a 1 minute or a minute and a half, very quick summary to catch some of the key points. So I might try that if I may. We started just discussing the idea of happiness versus wellness. And I think we broadly concluded they're two sides of the same coin. They go hand in glove. But that brought us into asking about the idea of happiness comes from relative thinking. So if you have a point of comparison, then your assessment of your own happiness may fundamentally change and fundamentally alter. I suppose that makes it a requirement then to look as much inward as outward, because if you only exclusively look outward for comparison, you may miss a whole lot of internal reasons to be or to feel happy. And Isabel, I think you made that particular point, but you also made the point at the same time that it's an evolutionary thing. It's a life cycle thing, that we don't necessarily come to that conclusion until we've been around a couple of blocks of happiness and perhaps unhappiness before we discover that we need to look equally inside as outside to arrive at our own sense of that wellness. That brought us into a discussion about culture, which brought us to a national level discussion. And then we moved into an organization focused culture. Paolo, you made two really interesting points about how we measure this. And you referred to the USA Organization of Psychology from 2000 that started looking at the individual measurement. And then 2010, the HBR articles that now started to look at the organizational value, economic value that can be put on wellness or well-being. That's brought us into the area of, so at national level, how might we go about measuring it? And Obi, you made reference to Bhutan's, where they have a number of key metrics. They've got 4 pillars, they've got 9 themes on which they actually try to make that measurement. I do know just from personal background reading and stuff, New Zealand has something similar. I'm just not familiar with the detail of that. That, I suppose, then brings us into, so at a national level of well-being, what can governments actually do? And Paul, you posed the question provocatively to us and absolutely bang on to say the unhappiness drivers. What might those unhappiness drivers be? And how do we avoid them? How do we stay away from them? 2 points arose there, is this sense of security. And the second thing was closeness to nature. And the final word, Paolo, I'm leaving it to your good self, in the concept of sharing gratitude. If we were to identify one thing that actually promotes happiness stroke well-being in both the giver and the receiver, it's expression, direct, overt expression and sincere expression of gratitude. And maybe that's something when we step back and look at our current society ills, maybe if we expressed a bit more gratitude and maybe a bit less expectation or belief in entitlement, maybe the wellness quotient or the happiness quotient might increase substantially. I'll leave it at that, Paul, if you wanted to round us. Yeah, I'll have to keep this one very short, Paul. Thank you both for some really interesting and provocative ideas. I suppose key point that we started with was culture operates nationally, organizationally, and even there are multiple subcultures. Well-being, tricky to define, difficult to track, very personal. It's personal to individuals. It's then personal to organizations. So challenging to make a correlation. So that would be my overall sense. Couple of things that I think came out of it. The whole question of the impact of national culture on organizational cultures, the timeline over which they might happen, where the shifts might be changing, have to be taken into account. We have all had an aberration, which was the pandemic, that took 2 years to more or less see us through it, making it even more challenging to make an assessment or a firm grounding of the impact of our culture on well-being. But I'd summarize it in the very last point, Anthony, that you made, which I think is one. It's an optimistic point, but it's the whole question of the impact of social media on our organizations. My analogy of the garden hose from 15 or 20 years ago to the multiple fire hoses of today, which is largely due to social media. But perhaps we are at the very bottom of that well-being curve, with the possibility to increase positively on well-being. But it's likely to need a shift, which you identified, Anthony, of does social media itself now need to change because of AI, because of the lack of clarity as to whose voice are we hearing? Is that likely to drive people back into individual personal connections? And from that, we would hope that personal well-being and collective well-being would start to actually have an upward trajectory into the coming years. But we very quickly moved on to the idea that we need to change the language. It's not about meeting because it conjures up too much preconceived ideas. So that you then took us, Ilke, again, you took us into the idea of transcripts and exploration of transcripts and the use of AI to analyze transcripts, summarize transcripts, and then create dynamic links back into the transcript if the summaries don't fully make sense to us. And that's all really valuable material. But this need to shift our thinking on the concept of meeting, and that conjured up the idea of a before, a during, and an after. Central to all of that is this idea that as human beings, we want to get together. But sometimes a big challenge that we have is trying to decipher all of the inputs that are taking place during our get-togethers. So where AI may become a real partner is in the preparation piece, as Ilke identified early on, where it could help us prepare agendas. In the meeting piece, where it can help us to dynamically either create visuals. Karen, you made that point, and there's a real visual out of that, the idea of mind maps and dynamically representing the conversation as it's happening. And then there's the idea of doing summaries after the event with links back into the transcripts to bring us into the full flow if that was necessary. Ilke, can I link that back to the visual that you gave us of conversation, the organization conversation being a river? I called it a river of discourse in my own meeting research, and that islands or meetings are islands within that conversation flow or that river of discourse within organizations. all of that was leading us to say, so what is the precise role that AI can fulfill in the context of getting together for whatever purpose? But that equally brought us into the area of, and I'll pick a number of words that we used. We talked about exploration, creativity, analysis, imagination, emotion. And I won't say we concluded, but I think we explored the idea that, well, AI isn't emotional. It doesn't have emotion. It gives us bland summary, but it doesn't infuse our engagements with passion, with commitment, with diversity, imagination, and stuff. So perhaps our biggest challenge with using AI in pursuit of supporting our get-togethers is to first define what it's meant to do to augment our natural and inherent human need, which is to get together and be emotional, be explorative, be inquisitive, all of the things that AI doesn't seem to be particularly good at. And we just need to figure out, before we go too far forward with AI, to say, what is it good at, and keep it doing what it's good at, and don't let it try and replace the bit that people are not only good at, we are the only ones capable of being emotional, sensitive, explorative, and so on. And maybe out of this conversation, we might not have redefined what our meetings should be, but maybe we've just put a mark on the ground to say, well, let's not engage AI too much more until we very clearly decide what is the boundary for it, how can it add value, rather than being in awe of what it can do that we can't do. But let's not forget what we can do that it can't do.
That's amazing.
I do, except for that I don't know if we should. I think the way you framed it was first figure it out and then start using. I actually think on that. No, a lot of the things that we were talking about, I don't know what it's going to be like in years, what a meeting will be. Suggesting, and I really liked your point about mindset. I think it's the mindset that you bring to it and the intentionality. I think it's if you without knowing how it's going to help, as you're doing that.
Absolutely. There's a final tradition that we have in hosting our fireside chats, and I normally try to do literally a 1 minute or a 1.5 minute review or summary of some of the key points that we've discussed. So if I may, I suppose we started our conversation really talking about how much engagement the coach has, and I perhaps mistakenly framed it in terms of speaking. And I think the three of you concurred that if a coach is speaking more than about 10%, it might be a little bit too much. But actually, Stefania, you said that in some instances, a little bit more initially might be necessary in order to build and establish that foundation and that relationship. But I think all of you also concurred that a key part of the coach's job is to be present. And Steve, I think you made the point that being present doesn't require you to speak, that actually being present is optimally achieved when you're not saying anything. So it's building that empathetic relationship through listening seems to be a key competence of the coach and of the coaching relationship. The 10% of time that you would end up speaking seems to be more focused on asking key questions to get to the bottom of what the coaching relationship is intended to be about. And Stefanie, I think you made the point tellingly later in our conversation that being clear on what the purpose of the coaching relationship is of paramount importance, because having that clarity then helps to maximally inform the nature and the content of the questions that are going to be asked. So again, coaching is not something that has this preordained long list of typical questions. It's more about the skill and the aptitude of the coach to be able to build that empathy through listening with their coachee. Steve, I think you introduced us to your personal core belief around our purpose in life and the idea of growth and the idea of love, and that both of those can be fused together through the coach's, I suppose, use of the coaching relationship to show that form of love. It's a platonic love, but it's a love for the underlying individual. And then through that, to enable the growth, which is one of the overriding purposes. That kind of brought us into the international dimension, where I put the question to you that from your experience, do national cultures have an impact on the coaching relationship? And probably the single biggest takeaway for me is that the three of you seem to concur that actually, when you strip away all of the national boundaries, national cultures, national histories, we are all people first and foremost. And at our core, it doesn't matter where we've come from. It actually matters that we are people, and that connection through the coaching relationship actually establishes fairly quickly and can transcend national backgrounds and national histories fairly rapidly. So I hope that has done some justice to a really interesting and in-depth exploration of coaching. Fad, fiction, or the future? My vote says, actually, I think it has a pretty good future, certainly in your three very capable hands.
Notes, but I've been trying to mentally track, I guess, the conversation that we've had so far. We started like our theme of measuring productivity versus performance, and I suppose that's where we separated out the idea of performance versus productivity. And I think it's fair to say that we came to the rough conclusion that productivity is relatively easy because it's quantitative, but performance, while performance can be reflected in the quantitative, it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And because it's not telling us the whole story, that then brought us into the conversation of monitoring or managing performance versus productivity of the collective versus the contribution of individuals to that collective. And I think that was partly, Michael, where you brought in the HIPO or hypo, which I love that particular idea as well. That partly reflected into the anecdote I provided myself of the person who contributes least may, in some instances, actually contribute most when measured from a slightly different perspective. So I guess that then brought us into our conversation about the time frame over which we choose to measure things. So if we're measuring against very short term, and Michael, you gave us the wonderful example of a 3-week piece of work that quantitatively can get measured against a report, a box ticked, but actually under the surface, we might discover not such a well-functioning team, probably not a team that's going to come back together again, probably an investment of time and resource that actually may not have produced nearly as much long-term productivity as we might have reasonably expected. So that concept of, if we measure something over a very short time versus over a very long period, how we go about measuring that, we need to be careful about, so that we actually measure, I suppose, the most indicative elements that are going to differentiate between the individual's performance versus the collective team performance. I think it's probably fair to say, in summary of our discussion, it's not as simple as just count the number of widgets that were produced at the end of the production line. When we come to the human person-people dynamic, and I think this is a key point, Sue, that you brought out, was we are absolutely people before we are machines. And in being people, measuring what we do, how we do it, and then more importantly, and Sue, I'm now leaning back into something you said, how we do it in conjunction with other people now becomes a really important challenge, so that we then focus on measuring the correct things in the most appropriate way. And it may not always be about quantitative. In fact, it probably won't be always only about quantitative. And we just need to be cautious that we don't measure the wrong thing and end up getting a potentially wrong result.